Hello and welcome to week 6 of 3250, an online course. We're going to talk more about Project 2 to include everything that you see on the screen. We will also review some examples of what not to do so that it will help you as you create your figures for Project 2. Because with Project 2, you're not really looking to recommend solutions. Think of it more like an informative visual report about an issue that your company is interested in. In particular, it's a visual report about the data sets associated with the issue or the topic. Project 2 is going to feature a total of 3 images that you have to create based off of numerical or maybe text-based data. And then once you have your 3 images created, you have to caption them properly. When you caption an image, each visualization should feature a name like figure 1, 2, 3. It should have a caption underneath, and it should be referred to in the text, such as figure 1 displays this correlation, or however you're going to put it. But as you can see on the screen, the bar graph has a caption underneath it, and it does not feature a title above it. I think we discussed that in the last video lecture, but with the caption, the title should already be in there, and a title above it is redundant. Each visualization or figure that you have in the report should aid to the story you're trying to tell, and the visualization should be distinct from the other, and they should complement your text. When constructing the text to complement the figures for Project 2, consider the formula you see on the screen. Those bullet points, it's a sort of list to help you construct your paragraphs about each subtopic, because just like you're going to have 3 figures for the report, correspondingly, you should have 3 subsections that are related to the figure, but also serves as a subtopic of the main purpose of your visual report. And while you are discussing the figure, you're discussing it because it's important to this subtopic that your company is somehow invested in. And as we can see from the sample, the student sample on the screen, the paragraphs followed the checklist that we see in the bullet points, starting with a topic sentence and then capping off their subsections with a form of analysis or maybe even an assumption on the trends they noticed or how important that data is in relation to your company's interest, their bottom line, either economically or your company has maybe cultural interests. So you're going to relate that your data in a way that speaks to your company. If you reviewed the assignment details for Project 2, you'll notice it specifies you having a purpose statement. This is a complex sentence, or it can feel that way, but it should quickly convey purpose. Why is the audience reading the report and why should they be interested? While also expanding clearly on the 3 subtopics you're going to explore, just like we can see from the sample purpose statement on the screen. And they end that purpose statement very clearly with the 3 subtopics that they plan on covering. For example, if you chose scenario 3 and then chose your own data set, maybe you decided to focus on the birth rates data set, and then your subsections would be mothers and the post-birth experiences, based on the 3 subtopics included on the screen. overall, your subtopics should be related to your data set. And in turn, your subtopics are going to shape the sorts of visualizations you hope to depict and for what purpose for your boss. How can you build a strong purpose statement? Practice using this formula on the screen. Then, looking at the student sample purpose statement, it's highlighted in front of us. We can see they followed the formula and they ended with subtopics so that their intent throughout the report is very clear. The purpose statement is your rudder, and it's going to guide the entire report in the direction that you want. Use the formula we reviewed to help you. The formula is also available in the modules. Information that seems harder to quantify, like words, can also be represented and analyzed in a visual way, adding to the understanding of the text in new ways. So for example, let's look at a report with just text, and that is the 2 sample pages we have in front of us. Overviewing it, it's not very impactful. And there's a lot of text to digest, even if we didn't reach 2 full pages. Now we have the same text that we saw before, but there are design elements in mind and complementing visuals and some color. The visuals that you add and you create help tell your story, your purpose, and the colors and the design template add to the appeal of the report. And if it helps you to complete the project, you can pretend as though you work for a company that believes in the topic and you are putting forth an educational visual report to circulate internally to the company for the purposes of then being reviewed by your boss. So you want to cater to these audiences that are invested. Think of the type of company that cares about your topic and what tone and visuals might capture their interest. So what if it was the other way around with just visuals on the report? What kind of story does this share then? From the screen, the student sample that we've been viewing, there's something there, but we're not quite sure what it's for overall. This is exactly how a student submitted their rough draft to me one semester. There was no text, and again, it was lacking in detail according to purpose and according to the assignment objectives. However, there is something there, but it's lacking in audience and document design. It's also lacking in ethos by not backing up their purpose and the look of the document. So I want you to avoid submitting just a text-based draft like we saw before, or just a visual-based draft like we can see here. Submit a combination of both text and your 3 visuals, and then worry about the finer details like the look of the report for the final draft. Don't worry about that this week per se. Use the assignment guidelines as your checklist when you're drafting your rough draft. I want you to, again, avoid submitting just text or just the visuals. You need to attempt to marry both for a successful rough draft. For my class, you can use information that you've already gathered in discussion posts and in class or in work to create your draft. So with the image design analysis assignment that's due this week, I'm forcing you to already have one image created for project 2 and to write some text to accompany it. And if you review the modules, you may have been inspired to draft your purpose statement after using the formula. And then from your outline assignment last week, you may have talked about your data set. And this kind of stuff could help you write an introduction before you add your purpose statement to cap off your introduction. The password for the day 2 assignment that asked for it for week 6 is on the screen. It's Clara and the Sun, which is a amazing but very weird novel I suggest you check out. Now let's review bad graphs and the assignments for this week. Okay, so with bad graphs, we could look at a few because there's quite a number of them, but we're really just going to review maybe 2 or 3 to get an idea of what is a bad graph or a bad visual and what are some traps to avoid when you're creating your visual and you want to be ethical and transparent with your data, and you also want what the purpose that you're conveying to come across. So that with this image, as you're reviewing it, consider some of maybe the strengths, some of the deficiencies, and maybe something you would change about the image. And if you look at it closely, maybe you already have realized there's no y-axis, which is a big problem. You always want the y and x axis, especially for this type of figure. Not all figures are going to require it, but this type, a chart like this, you need that. And then when we're looking at the supposed increase on the right, it appears to be 500% based on that arrow and when you line it up with the other part, but it's actually only 77%. That large red arrow has the visual effect of doubling this already inflated number by saturating our field of vision with more red color. To that end, think about how you use contrasting colors. If you're using red to indicate something bad, you might already be filtering your audience's mind to think of that number with something bad. And while that might be the default when we're thinking about something, instead, this visual could have been served better by maybe using different variations of blue, like a darker shade of blue and then a lighter shade of blue for the other parts of it, still to differentiate, but then not to have that supposed bad number in red, which would then spark that thought in our mind of red increase bad. So keep in mind that kind of trap to avoid when you're using red, or even if you're using maybe green for good or blue for good. Could you just use color variations of the same color? Do you have to use a lighter color for something you think is good? And so think about how you use color. And then the last thing for this image, although there's several, why use the weird people-shaped icons to represent spending? When you're creating these visuals, a lot of the time you're representing people, yes, but you don't want to belittle that fact in any way, and be cognizant of the fact that, yes, these numbers are probably representing individuals, or the way you're representing it may impact individuals. And so you want to be careful and responsible, and maybe, I don't want to say serious per se, but you want to make sure that you're representing it correctly. We'll look at this one because initially, I mean, I don't know if they look similar. The look of them is similar. They're titled the same, and really they're depicting, as we can see from the top, the same data, but different y-axis. So unlike the last visual that we saw, this does have a y and x axis, but when we look closer at those two things, we can see that one of the axis on the visual on the right, it starts at 0 like you should, whereas the one on the left hand starts at not 0. And so this is already a difference in a bad way that should be amended. You should always start at 0 with that y-axis so that it's clearer, the distinction between each of the numbers, and it's clearer for where you started out. Consider of the two graphs, the left on the right, which one is better? Or is either one better? When you think about it, the one on the left side has the benefit of actually showing us something about the data. But on the left side, there are numbers in the thousandths of a percent. The one on the left is likely meaningful only to an audience that cares about small adjustments in the interest rate, maybe like large scale investors, stock traders, and hedge fund managers, while the right side visual might be a more accurate representation in that the interest rate has not changed significantly during the period. And so if you were a realtor wanting to talk about the stability of these rates, maybe that figure would be better for you. But ultimately, the figure on the right doesn't really show us anything, and the whole point of a graph is to illustrate a change or comparison. And if there is no change, why graph this data? The bottom line is that context matters, and graphs should show us some meaningful relationship either in one variable over time or between two variables or more, if that's the case. So there are other visuals that we could look at. Some of them are really cool, and a lot of them are from websites that you could look up if you want to, like this one on gun deaths in Florida. You could look it up on Reuters website. And it kind of was trying to mirror this visual from, was it New York Times? And it didn't quite get it right. But we're not going to talk about any of these. And this one is from Fox, the cost of gas. We are going to talk about maybe my favorite, and this was a student submission years ago. But as you review it, the thing that pops out immediately is the title. And oh goodness, it implies that the presidents are committing the shootings. So this is a good opportunity to talk about potential pitfalls of concision or brevity. Concise language, or when you're thinking about brevity, it should still preserve the original meaning. So if you're trying to condense and how can I cut down on this longer phrase or sentence, don't take away your original meaning, because as you trim these words, you can accidentally alter the meaning as the example title shows. And as we know, it shouldn't even have a title above there. It should be a caption, and you should have titled it in the caption. If we're looking at the key, that little tiny dash we see to the right side, it suggests that the red line equals 4 or more people. And I think the message here is that a mass shooting is one with 4 or more victims. But in this context, it makes it seem like the line, which has its own numerical values somehow, it also represents 4 or more people. The line graph is inappropriate because we don't have continuous data, and this makes the slopes dubious. So it implies movement in the data across time, say from Bush Sr. to Clinton, without actually showing us years or the time difference. So the graph doesn't account for the difference in term lengths between the presidents either. Reagan was only in office, or was in office, for 8 years, whereas Bush Sr. was only in office for 4 years. So the graph's overall message is distorted because it implies a relationship between two variables that are not connected: mass shootings and presidents. You could argue about that all day, but that is the overall message of this graph. Yes, presidents can create policies that might address this issue, but a one-to-one comparison with this figure is not bolstering anyone's ethos. We could map all kinds of things in this way, like the number of pedestrian deaths during presidential terms, but it really wouldn't tell us anything meaningful and ultimately might portray a story that's not really there. So when you're creating your visuals, consider your use of color, red for bad and green or blue for good, and how to avoid that. Consider avoiding a skewed or manipulated or inaccurate story about your numbers or the data based on how you're plotting it. Remember to start the Y and X axis at the appropriate to have a Y and X axis, and then to start the Y axis at 0 and to plot each point with the numerical indicator like we can see on the screen. If anything, for this figure, I do like how they plotted each part of the line clearly so we could see what they meant. Okay. So that was our discussion about ethical pitfalls to avoid when depicting our figures and things to consider. And now let's look at Module 6 and the 2 assignments that you have due. The first one is a lot similar to last week when you had to create a visual and maybe you used your desktop to create a visual. But instead of just pulling a visual out of your ass, you're going to create a visual that has something to do with project 2. It's one of your visual ideas. Maybe you came up with, I'm going to make 2 pie charts and a timeline, and you decide to create a pie chart or some kind of chart for this assignment, and you only have to create one. So I'm going to open up that new document that I keep for this course. It already has some visuals there. Great. We'll pretend that I created this visual, but it has something to do with project 2. And then because the guidelines of the assignment asked me to, I also included a caption. I right-clicked it and I added a caption. And I'm ready to go with part 1. Part 2 is copy and pasting all of these questions, hitting reply. My answers to each of these questions based on my image, thinking about the image as I'm applying to each one of these questions, and then hitting the add and upload an image button rather than attaching my image so that it's easier for everyone to see it in the forum and no one has to download my image and they can see my text about it. So you're creating one image for project 2 at the beginning of the week, closing out the week. You're creating your entire rough draft of the report. And the rough draft should include your visuals and your text. To create the text for your report, there is a template like we can see on screen. I suggest how you should structure the text of your report. Additionally, I would review part 2 to make sure that I have my 3 visuals and that 2 of the 3 visuals are different from the other. My report is not longer than 2 to 3 pages. I thought about the use of white space and tried to eliminate that. No wasted space. I added captions to all my visuals. And I added the correct password. So if I were to create the report using this template, the text of my report might look like this. I would want to make sure I have the password either at the top or the bottom. Maybe you don't like it at the top of your report and it's messing with the look of it. I totally get it. Clara and the sun. But if we're following the template, we'd still have a title. We would have an introduction. The purpose statement would be the last part of your introduction. You don't have to bold it. I just did that for here. You would have subheaders to separate each major subtopic or subsection. You would have a conclusion that's separated with a space, but you don't have to have a subheader to indicate that it's the conclusion. Each subsection is going to discuss your corresponding figures that match the subtopic and the relevance of there. So say you have all of your text. The next thing you should do is start adding your visuals. Maybe I'm going to put it here. We'll just pretend I created this one. Let's put the other visual. We'll pretend I created this one. And finally, this one. And you want to right-click each visual and wrap the text tight or top and bottom. However, you want the text and your image to flow together. Sometimes top and bottom is easier depending on how big your image is going to be, or sometimes square works, or again, tight. However, you're going to do it, but you can then move it around and resize it to think about how much white or wasted space there is. Is it too small? Is it too big? It should never be taking up like half a page or even a quarter of a page, maybe even. It shouldn't be too big. So you're going to do that for each one of your images, the wrap text, somehow wrapping the text, maybe trying to remain consistent with the placement of them. So if I'm going to place it here for the first one, the second one should probably be placed in that same position rather than trying to stagger it, which you can, but that look doesn't always look consistent. But again, these are things you can worry about for later. And then if it's a bigger chart like this, it is kind of okay that it's this big. If you get smaller, it might be harder to see everything that you need to see. So for this, it could be okay that it is this big and that it does take up like a quarter of a page. So after all of that, maybe add a splash of color, deciding, oh, my entire report is going to be blue. All my subheaders are also, or like the main color of your report is going to be blue, your subheaders blue. So just very subtle nods to worrying about color scheme. I don't want you to think too much about design because you have your text, you have your accompanying visuals that you created, and you have captions and every other thing that is outlined here. You're good to go. And you're going to submit it on USF Writes. And if you're wondering how I'm going to grade the assignment, and before you submit your assignment, you should be reviewing your draft alongside this checklist, which also tells you how much each part is worth, to make sure that you're confident with your draft before you hit submit. If you have any questions, please reach out and have a great rest of your week.